A collision of worlds. The first-class cabin of Flight 927 was a sanctuary of opulence and privilege. Leather seats stretched luxuriously wide, their polished armrests gleaming under the soft amber glow of cabin lights. Passengers settled into their sanctuaries, sipping on flutes of champagne or tapping idly on their latest gadgets. This was a space carefully curated to exude comfort and exclusivity, a place where the unspoken rule of decorum reigned supreme. Serena Crawford, a striking woman with skin like polished mahogany and a cascade of curls framing her face, stepped into this haven. Dressed in an understated navy blazer and tailored trousers, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her modest leather tote and the subtle sheen of her pearl earrings hinted at an elegance that belied her immense fortune. Serena was the founder of Crawford Innovations, a multi-billion-dollar company revolutionizing renewable energy. But today, she was simply another passenger seeking reprieve after a week of high-stakes negotiations. The moment she entered the cabin, a ripple went through the air. Heads turned, glances exchanged. Some were brief, mere flickers of curiosity. Others lingered, their scrutiny less benign. Serena felt the weight of their gazes but paid them no mind. She had long mastered the art of appearing unbothered. Her success had taught her that her presence in such spaces often challenged unspoken assumptions. A flight attendant, Bethany, approached, her smile tight and forced. Bethany was a seasoned professional, her uniform crisp and her hair pulled into a flawless bun. Yet, there was a stiffness in her demeanor, a crack in her polished veneer. "Good evening," Bethany said, her voice pitched too high to sound genuine. "May I see your ticket?" Serena handed it over without hesitation. "Here you go," she said, her tone polite but firm. Bethany scrutinized the ticket as if it might reveal a hidden anomaly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she glanced between the ticket and Serena. "This is for seat 2A, Bethany said, her tone laced with doubt. "First class." "Yes, that's correct," Serena replied, her expression unchanging. Bethany hesitated, then handed the ticket back. "Very well," she said, though her smile remained brittle. "Let me know if you need anything." Serena nodded, placed her tote in the overhead compartment, and sank into her seat. She retrieved a hardcover book from her bag, the cover embossed with golden lettering, and began to read. But the serenity she sought was elusive. She could feel the subtle tension around her, the sidelong glances, the whispers that stopped just short of audible. Nearby, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat, stealing furtive looks at Serena. Across the aisle, a pair of women exchanged whispers, their eyes darting toward her and then away. Serena's fingers tightened on the edges of her book. It was a script she had lived too many times. Bethany returned minutes later, her smile now replaced by a veneer of professional detachment. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her tone dripping with exaggerated politeness. "I'll need to confirm your seat assignment again. We've had some issues with our booking system lately." Serena raised her gaze from the book, her expression calm but unyielding. "You already checked my ticket," she said. "Yes, of course," Bethany replied, "but just to ensure everything is in order." Serena sighed inwardly but retrieved her ticket. Bethany examined it with unnecessary scrutiny, her manicured nails tracing the printed details. She murmured, flipping the ticket unnecessarily. Sometimes the system assigns first-class seats by mistake. It's rare, but it happens. "That's not the case here," Serena said, her tone sharp enough to cut through Bethany's condescension. Bethany returned the ticket with a stiff nod. "Very well, ma'am. Let me know if you require anything." Serena's jaw tightened as Bethany retreated to the galley. The whispers around her grew louder, their intent unmistakable. Yet, Serena refused to let her composure falter. She had weathered storms far more severe than this. Minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and the captain emerged. Captain William Marks was a tall man with an air of authority, his silver hair and sharp features lending him an almost regal presence. He strode down the aisle with measured steps, stopping in front of Serena's seat. "Good evening," he said, his tone cool and detached. "Is there a problem here?" Serena met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "None from my end," she said. Bethany appeared at his side, her demeanor smug. "Captain, there seems to be some confusion about this passenger seat assignment," she said. "I've checked it twice, but—" Serena's patience snapped. "There is no confusion," she said, her voice steely. "I paid for this seat. I belong here." William's eyes narrowed. "First-class seats are reserved for certain clientele," he said, his tone laced with an unspoken insinuation. Serena's gaze hardened. "And what clientele would that be?" The captain's jaw tightened. "I'll ask you one last time," he said, his voice low. "Do you belong here?" The question hung in the air, its implications as sharp as a blade. Serena's fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She rose to her feet, her voice calm but resolute. "I do," she said. Without warning, the captain's hand lashed out, the slap echoing through the cabin. Gasps filled the air as passengers recoiled in shock. Serena's head turned from the force of the blow, but she quickly straightened, her eyes locking onto Williams with an unflinching resolve. A red mark bloomed on her cheek, vivid against her dark skin. "You'll regret that," she said, her voice a quiet storm. Serena picked up her belongings with measured grace and walked down the aisle, past the stunned faces of passengers who now avoided her gaze. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the weight of humiliation pressed down on her. But within her burned a fire that would not be extinguished. The echoes of injustice. Serena walked down the jet bridge, her steps deliberate and steady, though each one felt as if she were carrying the weight of the stairs and whispers she'd left behind in the cabin. The slap still stung, not just on her cheek, but in the depths of her soul. It wasn't the first time she'd been met with open hostility for daring to exist in spaces deemed not meant for her, but this was different. This was public, visceral, and humiliating in a way that decades of resilience couldn't completely shield her from. The lounge was quiet compared to the chaos she'd just endured. Travelers moved about in hushed tones, their movements languid as they waited for connecting flights. Serena found a quiet corner near a window overlooking the tarmac. She set her bag down and sank into a chair, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the mark on her cheek. The pain was a dull throb, but the indignity was sharp and unrelenting. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Who could she call? Who would understand the mix of fury, shame, and exhaustion coursing through her veins? Her assistant, Mia, would be her first choice, but she was back in New York, likely asleep given the late hour. Serena considered calling her lawyer, but even that felt too immediate. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman who stared back at her looked composed, unbroken. But Serena knew better. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A man in a black jacket stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He'd been on the same flight, seated in economy, though he'd barely drawn attention to himself at the time. Now, he stepped closer, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Crawford?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up, wary but composed. "Yes. My name is David Monroe. I'm a journalist." He held up his hands as if to reassure her. "I couldn't help but notice what happened on the plane." Serena's expression tightened. "If you're looking for a statement, you won't get one," she said, her tone clipped. David shook his head. "I'm not here to exploit this. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "What happened back there was wrong. And I think people need to know about it." Serena's eyes narrowed. "And why do you care?" He took a seat a respectful distance away, his movements slow and deliberate. Because stories like this don't just happen in a vacuum. People need to see what's happening, to understand it. You're Serena Crawford, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. If this can happen to you, imagine what happens to people without your platform. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. To her surprise, she found none. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him. Not yet. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Monroe, but this isn't the first time I've faced discrimination, and it won't be the last. It's just, life. Her voice faltered slightly, betraying the weariness she usually kept hidden. David leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent. But it doesn't have to be. Not if people speak up. Not if someone like you speaks up. Serena's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't sure if she admired his persistence or found it intrusive. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw Mia's name. Grateful for the distraction, she answered. Mia, she said, her voice softening. I'm glad you called. Serena, are you okay? Mia's voice was laced with concern. I just saw something on social media about you. People are posting about what happened on your flight. Serena's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Someone filmed it, Mia said. It's already going viral. Serena closed her eyes, a wave of dread washing over her. Of course someone had filmed it. In today's world, every moment was a potential headline, every injustice a chance for public scrutiny. What are they saying? She asked. It's mixed, Mia admitted. A lot of people are outraged on your behalf, but there are others. People questioning why you were in first class to begin with, making assumptions. You know how it goes. Serena's grip on the phone tightened. She did know how it went. The narratives would twist and turn, shaped by biases and ignorance. But maybe this time she could control the narrative. Mia, get in touch with my legal team, she said. And contact the PR department. I want a statement ready by morning. On it, Mia said. And Serena? Don't let them get to you. You're stronger than this. Serena smiled faintly. Thanks, Mia. As she ended the call, she glanced at David, who had been quietly observing her. Looks like you were right, she said. This story's already out there. David nodded. All the more reason to take control of it. Serena sighed. If I agree to talk to you, it'll be on my terms. No sensationalism. No twisting my words. Deal, David said immediately. I'll tell the story exactly as you want it told. For the first time that evening, Serena felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this moment of humiliation into something meaningful. Something powerful. But even as she made her decision, she knew the fight was far from over. The pilot, the flight attendant, the passengers who had looked away, they were symptoms of a much larger problem. And if she was going to confront it, she'd need every ounce of her strength and resilience. Serena leaned back in her chair, her mind already racing with the steps she'd need to take. The sting on her cheek had dulled, but the fire in her heart burned brighter than ever. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she would make sure their voices were heard. The turning tide. By the time Serena Crawford returned to her suite at the airport hotel, her emotions were a storm contained within a calm exterior. She had lived through discrimination before, in boardrooms where her intelligence was questioned, at charity galas where her accomplishments were overshadowed by whispered assumptions, but tonight, something was different. The slap wasn't just an act of physical violence, it was a visceral reminder of the unspoken barriers she faced every day. The video from the flight was already gaining traction online. Her assistant Mia had sent her a link to the post that started it all, a shaky recording showing the captain towering over her, his voice sharp and condescending, followed by the moment he struck her. The sound of the slap echoed even through the poor audio quality, followed by gasps and murmurs from the other passengers. Serena watched the video once, then closed her laptop. She didn't need to see it again to feel its impact. The world would see what happened to her, but she knew the narrative could shift in a heartbeat. Social media was a double-edged sword, a platform for justice but also a breeding ground for vitriol. She poured herself a glass of water and sat by the window, staring out at the blinking lights of planes taxiing on the runway. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Mia again. "Hey," Serena said, answering the call. "Serena, the response is growing fast," Mia said, her voice a mix of excitement and concern. "Your name is trending worldwide. Celebrities, activists, even some politicians are speaking out about what happened. This could be a turning point. Or a spectacle," Serena replied, her tone measured. "Have you spoken to the legal team?" "Yes. They're drafting a statement and preparing to file formal complaints against the airline and the captain. We're also exploring options for a press conference. But, Serena, you're the heart of this. People want to hear from you directly." Serena sighed. "I'll need time to think. This isn't just about me, it's about the message we send and how we frame it. I don't want this to be a moment that gets swallowed by the next viral story." "Understood," Mia said. "But don't wait too long. The world's attention span is short." As the call ended, Serena's thoughts drifted back to David Monroe, the journalist who had approached her earlier. He had been persistent but respectful, genuinely interested in telling her story. Maybe he could be an ally in shaping the narrative. Serena opened her laptop and typed his name into the search bar. His portfolio revealed a history of investigative pieces on systemic injustice, corporate corruption, and social reform. He wasn't chasing clickbait, he was chasing change. Serena picked up her phone again and called the number he had given her. "David?" "It's Serena Crawford," she said when he answered. "Ms. Crawford," he said, his voice steady but tinged with surprise. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you would." "I've seen your work," Serena said. "You have a way of telling difficult stories with integrity. I'm willing to share my experience, but I need to know this won't become a spectacle. This isn't just about me, it's about the larger issue." "I understand," David said. "And I promise you, my goal is to shine a light on the systemic issues that allow things like this to happen. You'll have full control over how your story is told." Serena hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's meet tomorrow morning. I'll have my team reach out to coordinate." As she ended the call, a sense of resolve settled over her. She wasn't just reacting to what had happened, she was taking control. For too long, she had let moments like this pass, choosing to focus on her work rather than the fight. But this time, the world was watching, and she had the chance to make them see. The next morning, Serena sat in a private conference room at the hotel, surrounded by her legal and PR teams. David Monroe sat across from her, a notebook open in front of him. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful. "We need to be clear about the objectives," Serena began. "This isn't just about the slap. It's about the systemic biases that allowed it to happen, the way the flight attendant questioned my presence in first class, the way the captain escalated without cause. This is bigger than me." Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Camille, nodded. "We'll focus on the airline's accountability. They'll likely issue a public apology, but we'll push for more diversity training, policy changes, and disciplinary action against the staff involved." David leaned forward. "Serena, your voice is going to be crucial here. People are already rallying behind you, but they need to hear your perspective. Not just what happened, but how it felt, what it means." Serena met his gaze. "You'll get my story, but I want it framed within the larger context. This isn't about painting me as a victim, it's about holding systems accountable." David nodded, scribbling notes. Understood. Let's start from the beginning. Walk me through everything, from the moment you boarded the plane to when you left the jet bridge. Serena took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the flight, her voice steady but charged with emotion. As she spoke, the room seemed to grow heavier, the weight of her words sinking in. David listened intently, his pen moving rapidly across the page. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Camille spoke. "This is powerful," she said. "But we need to anticipate the backlash. There will be people who question your motives, who try to discredit you." "Let them," Serena said, her voice firm. "I've spent my entire career proving myself to people who doubted me. This is no different." David closed his notebook. "Serena, I'll write the piece and send you a draft before it goes live. You'll have final approval." "Thank you," Serena said. "Let's make sure this matters." As the meeting wrapped up, Serena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The slap on that plane had been an insult, but it was also a spark, a moment that ignited something larger. She had spent years building her empire, breaking barriers in a world that often sought to keep her out. Now, she would use that platform to confront the injustices she had endured. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. And Serena Crawford wasn't backing down. A storm of accountability. By the afternoon, Serena Crawford's name was plastered across news outlets, social media platforms, and the mouths of strangers in coffee shops and airport lounges. The video of her confrontation with Captain William Marks had sparked not only outrage but a deep, uncomfortable conversation about systemic racism, privilege, and the veneer of exclusivity that shielded such behavior in high places. For Serena, the morning had been a blur of meetings, phone calls, and media inquiries, but she knew the real challenge was yet to come. Sitting in her hotel suite, Serena watched the news coverage with a sharp eye. Anchors and commentators dissected the incident, some praising her composure, others questioning her motives. A few had even gone so far as to accuse her of seeking attention. Serena's jaw tightened, but she reminded herself of the bigger picture. This wasn't about the noise, it was about the change she could create from it. Her assistant Mia burst into the room, tablet in hand. "Serena, you need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. Serena raised an eyebrow and gestured for Mia to continue. Mia handed her the tablet, where a live feed of a press conference from the airline was playing. The CEO of Northern Skies Airlines, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a carefully composed expression, stood behind a podium flanked by corporate branding. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 927, he began, his tone measured and rehearsed. Northern Skies Airlines has always prided itself on providing an inclusive and respectful environment for all our passengers. We are conducting a thorough investigation into the actions of Captain William Marks and our flight attendant, Bethany Green. Both individuals have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this inquiry." Serena's lips pressed into a thin line. The statement was polished, as expected, but it lacked the sincerity she hoped for. It was damage control, not accountability. Mia hovered nearby. "Social media is calling it a non-apology," she said. "People want to see action, not just words." Serena nodded. "And they'll get it," she said. "But not on the airline's terms. We'll set the narrative." That evening, Serena's team had arranged a private meeting with a group of influential activists, lawyers, and public figures who had reached out in support. The gathering took place in a sleek conference room, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Among the attendees were civil rights leaders, media strategists, and even a high-profile congresswoman who had been following the story closely. Serena stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding yet approachable. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about the systems that allow this kind of behavior to persist, not just in the skies but everywhere. A man in his 40s, a prominent activist named Marcus Bell, leaned forward. "You've got the world's attention, Serena. That's a powerful thing. But it's also dangerous. The wrong move could overshadow the message we're trying to send." Serena nodded. "Agreed. That's why I'm relying on all of you to help me navigate this. We need to be strategic. The goal isn't just accountability for the airline, it's lasting change." The Congresswoman, a poised woman in a tailored suit, spoke next. "Have you considered testifying before Congress? We're already discussing hearings on racial bias in corporate America. Your story could be a catalyst for meaningful legislation." Serena's eyes widened slightly. The idea of testifying had crossed her mind, but hearing it from someone with influence made it feel more tangible. "If it means pushing the conversation forward, I'll do it," she said. David Monroe, who had been quietly observing the discussion, finally spoke. "Serena, your story is already resonating with people. But to keep the momentum going, we need to humanize it. Let the world see who you are beyond the headlines. Share your journey, your struggles, and your triumphs. That's what will inspire people to act." Serena considered his words carefully. She had always been a private person, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But maybe David was right. Maybe opening up was the key to making this moment more than just a fleeting headline. The next morning, Serena sat in a studio preparing for a live interview with one of the nation's most prominent news anchors. The lights were bright, the cameras imposing, but Serena sat poised and ready. Her PR team had worked tirelessly to prepare her, but she knew the authenticity of her words would matter more than any rehearsed lines. As the broadcast began, the anchor introduced Serena with a montage of clips, her groundbreaking achievements in renewable energy, her philanthropic work, and, of course, the now infamous video from the flight. When the camera cut to Serena, she offered a calm but resolute smile. "Ms. Crawford, thank you for joining us," the anchor began. "The video of your experience on Flight 927 has sparked a national conversation. How are you feeling now, days after the incident?" Serena took a breath. "I'm feeling determined," she said. "Determined to use this moment to address the deeper issues that this incident represents. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless people who face discrimination every day, often without a platform to speak out." The anchor nodded. "The airline has issued a statement and placed the individuals involved on leave. Do you feel that's enough?" "It's a start, but it's not enough," Serena replied. "Accountability isn't just about punishing individuals, it's about addressing the culture and policies that allow this behavior to exist. I've called for a full review of Northern Skies Airlines training programs and policies, as well as broader industry reforms to ensure inclusivity and equity." The interview continued, with Serena sharing her experiences and her vision for change. By the end, the anchor's tone had shifted from professional detachment to genuine admiration. As Serena left the studio, her phone buzzed with notifications. Messages of support poured in from all corners of the world, activists, business leaders, everyday people who had been inspired by her words. But there was one message that stood out. It was from an anonymous whistleblower claiming to be a former employee of Northern Skies Airlines. The message contained documents, internal emails, memos, and reports, that painted a damning picture of the airline's culture. Discrimination complaints had been routinely ignored, and employees who spoke out had faced retaliation. Serena forwarded the documents to her lawyer with a single note, "This changes everything." With this new evidence, Serena knew the fight was far from over. But now, she had the tools to take it to the next level. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore, she was standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or excluded. And she was just getting started. Breaking the silence. Serena Crawford's suite at the airport hotel had become a war room. Papers were spread across the table, laptops hummed with activity, and her team worked tirelessly, fueled by caffeine and purpose. The leaked documents from the anonymous whistleblower had exposed a toxic culture at Northern Skies Airlines, one where discrimination wasn't an anomaly but a pattern. For Serena, this wasn't just ammunition, it was validation. Her lawyer, Camille, paced the room, her phone pressed to her ear. "We'll need to confirm the authenticity of these documents," she said, her voice sharp and efficient. "But if they're real, we're looking at a massive class action lawsuit. This could bring the entire company to its knees." Serena sat at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. Each memo, each ignored complaint, was a story of someone who had been silenced, dismissed, or retaliated against. These weren't just words on a page, they were lives, each one a testament to the systemic issues she had long suspected. "Camille," she said, interrupting the lawyer's conversation. "I want to meet the whistleblower." Camille ended her call and turned to Serena. "That could be risky. We don't know who they are or what their motives might be." "I don't care," Serena replied. "If they were brave enough to come forward, the least I can do is hear them out." "Set it up." Camille hesitated but nodded. "I'll arrange something discreet." The meeting took place later that evening in a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city. Serena arrived early, dressed in casual clothes that allowed her to blend in. She sat in a corner booth, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room. Camille had insisted on accompanying her, sitting at a nearby table, her presence both reassuring and protective. The whistleblower arrived minutes later. He was a young man, no older than 30, with tired eyes and a nervous energy. He introduced himself as Ethan and slid into the booth opposite Serena, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a folder on the table. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure if you'd take me seriously." "Ethan," Serena said, her tone warm but firm, "you've already done something incredibly brave by coming forward. I'm here to listen." Ethan nodded, his gaze darting around the room as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I worked in HR at Northern Skies for 3 years," he began. "I saw things that I couldn't ignore. Complaints about discrimination were swept under the rug. People who spoke out were either fired or pressured to resign. The higher-ups only cared about protecting the company's image." He opened the folder and handed Serena a series of documents. "These are internal emails, reports, even transcripts from meetings. They show how the company systematically ignored or covered up issues. It's not just about racism. There's sexism, harassment, everything you can think of." Serena's fingers tightened on the papers as she read them. Each word was a blow, a confirmation of the rot within the airline's culture. "Why are you coming forward now?" she asked, looking up at Ethan. He hesitated, then said, "Because of you. When I saw what happened on that flight and how you handled it, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. People like you shouldn't have to fight alone." Serena felt a lump rise in her throat but swallowed it down. She reached across the table and placed a hand on Ethan's. "Thank you for trusting me. I promise you, we'll use this to make real change." Ethan nodded, a faint flicker of relief crossing his face. "Just, be careful," he said. "The people running that company won't go down without a fight." The next day, Serena held a press conference in the hotel's ballroom. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, and members of the public who had come to show their support. Serena stood at the podium, flanked by Camille, David Monroe, and a few of the activists who had joined her cause. "Thank you all for being here," Serena began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to me on Flight 927 was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a culture of discrimination and exclusion that permeates not just Northern Skies Airlines but many institutions." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Today, I'm calling for more than just accountability. I'm calling for systemic change. We have obtained evidence that shows how Northern Skies has failed its employees and customers time and time again. This isn't just my fight, it's a fight for everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel like they don't belong. Camille stepped forward, holding up a folder. These documents, provided by a brave whistleblower, reveal a pattern of misconduct within Northern Skies Airlines. We are filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of the employees and customers who have suffered due to this toxic culture. This is about justice, not just for Serena but for everyone. The room erupted into a flurry of questions and camera flashes, but Serena remained composed. She knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. As the press conference ended, Serena's phone buzzed with messages of support. Activists, celebrities, and even strangers had reached out to offer their solidarity. But amidst the flood of positivity, there were also threats and attempts to discredit her. She had expected this, but it still weighed on her. Later that evening, she sat alone in her suite, staring out at the city lights. The fight ahead would be grueling, but she was ready. She thought of Ethan and the countless others who had suffered in silence. They deserved a voice, and she would be that voice. As she sipped her tea, a notification popped up on her phone. It was a news alert: Northern Skies CEO resigns amid scandal. Serena allowed herself a small smile. It was a victory, but it wasn't the end. The system had been cracked, but it needed to be dismantled entirely. Serena Crawford wasn't just a passenger on Flight 927. She was now the face of a movement. And she wouldn't stop until the skies were truly inclusive for everyone. The flight to justice. The city skyline sparkled against the night, a beacon of hope and chaos as Serena Crawford prepared for the most critical moment of her fight. The momentum from the press conference had shaken Northern Skies Airlines to its core. The resignation of their CEO was only the beginning. Their stock had plummeted, lawsuits were pouring in, and calls for sweeping reform grew louder. But Serena knew that to create lasting change, she would need to take the fight beyond the boardrooms and into the hearts of the public. That evening, Serena's penthouse suite was alive with energy. Her team worked tirelessly, finalizing details for her upcoming congressional testimony. A cacophony of keyboards clacking, phone calls ringing, and voices debating filled the room. Despite the chaos, Serena sat calmly at the head of the table, reviewing the draft of her speech. "Serena," Camille said, walking over with a document in hand. "This just came in from the investigative team. It's a report on the flight attendant, Bethany Green, and Captain William Marks. You need to see this." Serena took the file and began reading. The findings were damning. Bethany had a history of complaints against her, ranging from microaggressions to outright discriminatory behavior, all ignored by management. Captain Marks's record was even worse. He had been involved in several incidents where his judgment was questioned, but his seniority and connections had always protected him. Serena closed the file and placed it on the table. "We're not just fighting a company," she said, her voice steady. "We're fighting a culture that rewards silence and punishes accountability. This ends now." The day of the congressional hearing arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. Cameras flashed as Serena stepped out of her car and walked up the marble steps of the Capitol. Dressed in a tailored black suit, she exuded confidence and determination. Behind her were Camille, David Monroe, and Ethan, the whistleblower who had become an invaluable ally. The hearing room was packed. Politicians, journalists, and spectators filled every available seat. At the center of it all was Serena, seated at a table with a microphone in front of her. The room quieted as the chairperson called the hearing to order. "Ms. Crawford," the chairperson began, "thank you for joining us today. Your experience has sparked a national conversation about racial bias and systemic discrimination. We're here to listen to your story and, more importantly, to discuss how we can prevent incidents like this from happening again." Serena took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Chairperson. I'm here today not just as someone who endured injustice but as someone who believes in the possibility of change." She began recounting her experience on Flight 927, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She described the subtle slights, the overt hostility, and the moment Captain Marks struck her. She spoke about the systemic issues revealed in the leaked documents and the bravery of those like Ethan who had come forward. "This isn't just about one flight or one airline," she said. "It's about the countless individuals who face discrimination every day, often without the means or platform to fight back. It's about creating a culture where accountability isn't optional and where inclusivity isn't just a buzzword." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Even the most seasoned politicians seemed moved. One senator, a veteran of the civil rights movement, leaned forward. "Ms. Crawford, your courage is remarkable. What specific changes would you like to see implemented?" Serena didn't hesitate. "Mandatory bias training for all airline staff, transparent reporting and accountability mechanisms, and federal oversight to ensure compliance. But more than policies, we need a shift in mindset. This isn't just a legal issue, it's a moral one." Her testimony continued for over an hour, with senators and representatives asking questions and applauding her resilience. By the end, the chairperson thanked her personally. "Ms. Crawford, your testimony will serve as a foundation for the reforms we aim to implement. Thank you for your bravery." As Serena left the hearing room, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions and flashing cameras. She paused briefly, turning to face them. "This fight isn't over," she said. "But together, we can ensure that no one else has to endure what I did. Change is coming." That evening, Serena returned to her hotel, exhausted but fulfilled. The congressional hearing had been a significant step, but it wasn't the end. As she sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from Ethan. "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak out. You've inspired more people than you know." Serena smiled, her resolve strengthened. She opened her laptop and began drafting an op-ed for one of the country's leading newspapers. The title was clear in her mind, "Breaking the Barriers in the Skies and Beyond." In the weeks that followed, Serena's fight continued. The class action lawsuit against Northern Skies gained traction, with more employees and customers coming forward. The airline announced a complete overhaul of its policies and leadership, but Serena's focus had shifted to the larger industry. She launched an initiative called Wings of Change, aimed at promoting inclusivity and accountability across all airlines. Her story became a rallying cry, not just for those in aviation but for anyone fighting discrimination. She received letters from young women inspired by her courage, employees emboldened to speak out, and leaders committed to making their workplaces better. One evening, as she prepared for another speech, Serena received a package. Inside was a framed photograph of her walking up the Capitol steps, surrounded by her team. Attached was a note from David Monroe. "This is the image of change. Keep soaring." Serena placed the photograph on her desk, her heart swelling with pride and purpose. She had set out to fight for justice, but along the way, she had ignited a movement. And though the skies had once sought to limit her, she now knew that her potential, and the potential of those like her, was boundless. This wasn't just her journey, it was the beginning of a revolution.